In 2014, Christina Skates was a college student in Ohio, occupying her time with a task that most would find monotonous. She was browsing online cemetery records, scrolling through digital ledgers that catalog the final resting places of thousands of people. In this corner of the internet, history is reduced to a uniform pattern of names, birth dates, and death dates, blurred together by the sheer repetition of the data. Most entries look exactly the same, routine, finished, and offering no reason for a stranger to linger on them. Then she reached a record that broke the pattern. It was an entry for a burial that contained no name. In the space where a person's identity should have been, the description was purely clinical. Unknown white female bones. Below that, a date of death was listed. February 5th, 1975. There was no estimated age, no social security number, no reference to a police case file, and no notes explaining why the individual remained unidentified 40 years later. What caught Christina's attention was not just the fact that the woman was nameless. It was the way the system had categorized her. In the world of bureaucratic records, an entry is usually left open or flagged if information is missing. But this record appeared complete. The burial had been logged. The plot had been assigned. The entry was closed. There was no indication in the digital ledger that anything remained unsolved or anyone was still looking for the woman's identity. It suggested that, as far as the official record was concerned, unknown white female bones was a sufficient final answer. The location of the burial added a layer of proximity that Christina could not ignore. The cemetery was located less than 20 minutes from where she had grown up. This was not a story from a distant city or a different era of forensic science that she couldn't grasp. It meant that in the mid-1970s, someone had been killed near her hometown. Their remains had been processed by the local authorities, and they had been placed in the ground without a name. For decades, the system had functioned around this absence without attempting to correct it. Christina began to wonder how a person could be buried so close to home with the modern administrative system and yet remain entirely invisible. She wasn't an investigator, but the finality of that complete record felt like a mistake. To understand how the entry came to look that way, she began tracing the history of those bones backward, looking for the moment the investigation had simply stopped moving. The story of the bones began on a cold day in February 1975. 3 teenage boys were hiking through the Mill Stream Run Reservation, a stretch of parkland near the Rocky River in Ohio. As they moved through the brush, they noticed something white scattered across the forest floor. At first, they were uncertain of what they were seeing. The objects were weathered and partially covered by the winter landscape. When they realized they were looking at human remains, they contacted the authorities. The officers from the Cleveland Metro Park Police arrived to secure the scene. They conducted a search of the immediate area and recovered what were described as partial skeletal remains. The condition of the find made it clear that the body had been there for a significant amount of time. Months of exposure to the Ohio seasons had caused the remains to scatter, and local wildlife had carried portion of the skeleton away from the initial site. Most notably, The jaw was missing, and nearly all the teeth, the most common tool for forensic identification in 1975, were gone. Despite the missing pieces, the medical examiner was able to determine the cause of death almost immediately. A small caliber bullet was found lodged in the left temple of the skull. This wasn't a death by natural causes or an accidental fall in the woods. It was a homicide. The victim was identified as a young woman, though without a complete skeleton or dental records. Her age could only be estimated within a broad range. Investigators looked for anything that could lead to a name. They combed the area for personal belongings, a purse, jewelry, or scraps of clothing, but found nothing. They checked missing person reports from the surrounding jurisdictions, but in 1975, these records were often kept on paper and were rarely shared across the county lines, unless there was a specific reason to do so. With no witnesses and no immediate matches, the momentum of the case began to stall. By the third month, the administrative reality of the situation took over. Without a name, without active leads, the remains could not be kept in the morgue indefinitely. In May 1975, the woman was moved to a potter's field at Memorial Garden Cemetery. This was a section of the graveyard reserved specifically for indigent or the unidentified. A place for people the system had no way to categorize. She was placed in an unmarked grave, and the paperwork was filed away. Nearly 40 years, the woman ceased to be an active case. She existed only as a forensic description in a folder and a line in a burial ledger. The investigation hadn't been solved. It had simply transitioned into a state of permanent storage. When Christina Skates began her search decades later, she expected to find evidence of a massive, failed effort to identify the woman. She assumed there would be thick files detailing every lead that went nowhere. Instead, she found a void. She started with the archives of local newspapers from 1975. She expected to see headlines or follow-up stories about a Jane Doe found in the reservation. What she found instead was a single brief mention of the discovery near the Rocky River. The article was short, published without a photograph of the clothing or a request for the public to help identify the victim. After that one mention, the story disappeared from the public consciousness entirely. There were no anniversary updates and no pleas from investigators for new information. Christina then began contacting police departments in Cleveland, Akron, and the surrounding county offices. The responses she received highlighted a systematic breakdown in record keeping. Some departments had no record that the case had ever existed. Others acknowledged that they might have files, but because they had never been digitized, finding them would require a manual search that no one was prepared to conduct. In one instance, an official suggested to her that if the victim had gone 40 years without a name, there was likely a reason for it, and advised her that her time would be better spent elsewhere. The break in the silence finally came when Christina reached Lieutenant Don Silvis of the Cleveland Metro Parks Police. Unlike the other officers, Silvis was willing to look. He located the original case files, physical documents that had sat untouched in a drawer since the mid-1970s. He shared copies with Christina, including the original crime scene photographs and the forensic reports from the medical examiner. As Christina reviewed the documents, the problem became clear. The reports didn't end because the leads were exhausted. They ended because the leads were never connected to anything else. The file showed that woman's description had never been systematically compared to missing person reports from other cities. Christina began sharing the details she found on online forums dedicated to cold cases. Soon, other researchers began checking records from the same 1974 to 1975 period. They found that several teenage girls had gone missing in nearby cities like Akron and Cleveland during that time. These cases were logged under different jurisdictions, each with their own detectives and their own filing systems. The information was there, but it existed in silos. The remains were in one county and the missing person reports were in another. Because the departments did not communicate, the two halves of the story never touched. By 2016, a major obstacle remained. In the world of cold cases, families don't usually find their loved ones by looking at forensic data or case numbers. They recognize a face. And for 40 years, the woman from the Rocky River had no face. This was the point where Carl Kopelman joined the effort. Kopelman was a former CPA who had spent years training himself in the highly specialized field of forensic facial reconstruction. As a volunteer, he worked on cases of unidentified remains that the state had long since moved to the back burner. When he first received the photographs of the remains from Christina, he did not start work immediately. He hesitated. The skull was significantly damaged, and the missing jawbone meant that the most vital reference points of a person's lower face were gone. For several months, Kopelman left the case untouched, unsure if an accurate reconstruction was even possible. When he finally returned to it, he did so with a philosophy of restraint. He did not try to create a dramatic or artistic portrait. Instead, he estimated the facial structure based on the remaining attachment points of the skull. He chose neutral features, hair color, eye shape, and skin tone that reflected the forensic estimates, to ensure that he wouldn't accidentally lead a family in the wrong direction. When the reconstruction was finished, it did not look like a character from a movie. It looked like an ordinary young woman. It was a face that could have belonged to anyone's daughter, sister, or friend. As the image began to circulate online, it forced a shift in investigation. The conversation moved away from the bones in the woods and towards who is this person. But this shift also exposed a final critical failure of the administrative process. When Kopelman contacted the county medical examiner's office to cross-reference his work, he discovered that the case did not appear in the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, known as NAMUS. This wasn't a matter of a misfiled document or an incomplete entry. The case had never been entered into the national database at all. While families across the country were searching this database for their missing relatives, the woman from the Rocky River was invisible to them because the paperwork had never been transitioned into the digital age. Once the case was finally entered into NAMUS, the resolution was almost immediate. In Akron, Sergeant Jeff Smith was conducting a routine search of the database for old missing person files. He saw the new listing, the age range, the 1974 time frame, and the geographic proximity, all aligned with a report his department had held for 4 decades. The name in that report was Linda Marie Pagano. The transition from a nameless record to a confirmed identity was not a quick process. It required a level of scientific certainty that would stand up decades after the crime. Because the original dental records were incomplete, the only way to be sure was through DNA testing. This meant the state had to exhume the remains from the unmarked graves in Potter's Field. The first attempt at exhumation illustrated how deep the system's neglect had gone. When the team dug at the coordinates provided by the old cemetery records, they recovered the remains of a completely different person. The records for the Potter's Field were so poorly maintained that the unknown white female wasn't even where the map said she should be. It took a second, more extensive search to locate the correct site. Once the remains were finally recovered, samples were sent for mitochondrial DNA testing to compare against the Pagano family. In June 2018, the results came back. The match was positive. After 43 years, the remains found along the Rocky River were officially identified as Linda Marie Pagano. Linda had been 17 years old when she vanished. She was a girl who worked part-time, saved her own money, and was deeply into the music of the era. On 31st August 1974, she had gone to see Crosby, Stills, Nash, and Young at Cleveland Stadium. When she returned home late that night, an argument occurred, the kind of friction common in many households with teenagers. Linda left the apartment to clear her head, and she never came back. Her family had reported her missing the very next day, but because she was 17, the authorities at the time often treated such cases as runaways rather than potential victims of foul play. The identification brought a strange kind of closure. Because so much time had passed, the hope for a legal resolution was thin. Witnesses had died, the original evidence had degraded, and the trail of the person who had pulled the trigger in the woods were now cold. The case was officially ruled a homicide, but there would be no trial and no conviction. In January 2019, a small ceremony was held. Linda was moved from her anonymous plot and laid to rest besides her mother. She was no longer a case number or a closed entry in a digital ledger. The work of Christina Skates and Carl Kopelman did not just find one girl, it forced a review of other cold files in the region. Their efforts uncovered several other missing person reports that had never been properly cross-referenced, leading to further identifications. Christina never viewed herself as a detective. She simply pointed out that a record claiming to be complete was actually missing a person's life. Linda Marie Pagano is now remembered not for how she died, but as a person who lived, who was missed by her family, and who, after 40 years of being invisible, finally came home. And somewhere else, in another database or another cemetery ledger, another complete record is waiting for someone to stop and ask why it has no name.